Hello, welcome to our Fight for Freedom podcast by Myra and Rosa. Today we will be covering the infamous Supreme Court case Korematsu versus United States and the lengths it took to avoid internment camps. We will be discussing the racial suffering that the people in our country have gone through. Fred Korematsu's refusal to go to an incarceration camp highlights the essential balance between individual rights and civic responsibilities, as his resistance paved the way to obtain acceptance of his race within society again, emphasizing Asian American rights and freedom from discrimination and hatred, while encouraging others to continue fighting for Asian American civil rights, contributing to lasting societal change. Now let's pass it on to my partner to give us a rundown on the background.
Hello, guys, I'm Myra, and let's begin by giving a better understanding of the origin of this story. Looking back to the 1800s, Japan and the United States were allies and civil towards each other. Nonetheless, in the late 1860s, Japanese people began immigrating to the United States due to misplacement and economical struggles for better opportunities to grow. Unfortunately, they weren't having a manageable time adjusting to their new lives due to racial discrimination and harsh working conditions that they were being put through. For example, Japanese Americans during this period of time had to go through many hardships as well as being segregated from families and were having difficult time finding secure jobs that ended up being abusive work environments. A few decades later, in the early 1900s, conflict arose between Russia and Japan on account of territorial conflict over Manchuria and Korea. As a result, Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States at the moment, found a peaceful solution between the two countries. As time passed, tension only grew further between the United States and Japan due to the feeling of competition over who had more power in the Chinese market. At this time in history, trade was extremely popular and it was a big aspect on how both economies financially grew. The United States wanted to acquire as much power over the market as they were rising onto their peak of becoming a world power. When World War II started in 1939, Japan's expansionism in Asia intimidated American economical interests such as oil. Japan wanted to keep the United States from interfering in their expansion in Asia. Therefore, in 1941, Japan planned a secret attack on the United States' primary naval base, which is known as the Pearl Harbor attack. This was to weaken the U.S. military and allow Japan to obtain its oil supplies. Officially, they became enemies, initiating the United States' involvement in World War II and causing resentment towards Japanese Americans.
Thank you, Myra, for that overview on the background. Now I will be covering our main event. In 1942, Executive Order 9066 was declared upon all Japanese Americans in the United States. This action was done out of fear. The United States was afraid that the Japanese Americans would strike against them. That same day, the military started mass incarcerations into internment camps. The relocation of Japanese Americans was a mandatory order from President Roosevelt, causing them to leave their homes and jobs. In the internment camps, Japanese Americans were not required to work but still got their rights stripped from them. Amongst thousands of Japanese Americans in the country, there was one man in particular, a 23-year-old born in Oakland, California, Fred Korematsu, living in San Leandro with his parents and wife when the executive order took charge. When Japanese Americans were being forced to relocate, Korematsu refused to leave his life behind. Korematsu was so against going into an internment camp that he took extreme measures to ensure that he would stay a free man. For example, he had cosmetic surgery on his eyes to make him seem less quote unquote Asian, as well as changing his name to Clyde Sarah and saying that he was of Spanish and Hawaiian descent. This persona did not last long, as the FBI quickly captured him 6 months later. He was transferred to an internment camp in Utah. While being there, he was willing to challenge the constitutionality of World War II Japanese incarceration, requesting to take it to the Supreme Court, which ended up being in San Francisco. During the case, he stood up for his rights, and the court rejected his claim due to racial bias, resulting in being given 5 years of probation and being established in an assembly center located in San Bruno, California. In the center, they were surrounded by barbed wire fences, and they didn't have the freedom to move as they pleased. The Japanese Americans tried to make the circumstances feel better by making it feel like home. In the camps, they established newspapers, markets, schools, police, and fire departments. They lived there for 4 years until 1946, when Executive Order 9066 was repealed by President Gerald Ford. And with that, we'll pass it over to Myra once again to dive deeper into the effects afterward.
Alright, now that we've touched on the main event, let's shift gears a bit into the impacts that occurred afterwards. Shortly after Korematsu took the case to the Supreme Court, it was a 6-3 decision, meaning it was justified as not threatening his rights. Japanese Americans also lost their homes and businesses, meaning they had a difficult time readjusting to their new lives. They felt oppressed considering the fact they had lost everything like their safety. Regardless of the release from internment camps and the money that was given to some people, still felt internally damaged for life, facing racism as time went on, which continued to bring challenges as their lives continued. Many struggled with emotional trauma and getting back on their feet.
I was determined that my rights were violated.
Were you afraid of being arrested?
No, I wasn't, because I didn't feel that I did anything wrong. And if anybody did wrong, it was the law, because I figured it was unconstitutional what they were doing.
To this day, the case has never been fully overturned, but is used as a symbol of when civil rights are ignored in the name of national security. Ever since the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the legal system has become more cautious when it comes to handling racial discrimination cases and actions. As for Fred himself, he returned to his home in California, and as we stated earlier, he still faced prejudice for challenging the government. Up until the 80s, he was still a legally convicted criminal, but later in the 80s, more information came out about the internment camps and his case was revisited. In 1983, a legal team helped overturn his conviction by federal district court. Fred, on the other hand, continued on as a civil rights leader who fought for people's rights.
And that concludes our discussion of Korematsu versus United States, a landmark case that continues to influence our comprehension of civil liberties, national security, and racial bias. It powerfully shows the common consequence of legal decisions and points out the importance of safeguarding individual rights, especially during crisis. This case didn't just affect Fred Korematsu, it impacted an entire community, and its lessons are still relevant in today's world. Thank you for your time and attention. We hope you enjoyed our insight in history from the Fight for Freedom podcast.